Okay, welcome everybody. So glad to be with you this afternoon and be part of your Healthy Workplace Month. My name is Catherine Wilcox, and I work with the Organizational Wellness Department of Homewood Health. My background is in clinical counseling and in mental health, workplace mental health specifically, and I've spent a good part of my career working in healthcare as well. I was just chatting with Ellen at the beginning of the session about just my experience working as a healthcare leader in occupational health and safety for a number of years. And so anytime I get the opportunity to facilitate for a healthcare audience, I feel right at home. And it's, again, really wonderful to be with you for our hour session today. As was mentioned, this is a recorded session. So if folks are not comfortable with the recording, please feel free to access, the recorded session at a later time if you're not comfortable participating live in a recorded event. This is just a statement that sort of summarizes the parameters of the recording and its use. So again, feel free to access the recording later on if you'd be more comfortable doing that. Just a few important pieces of information and acknowledgements before we begin our session today. One is how to get in touch with us at Homewood Health. I just really want to acknowledge that today's topic is something that many of us, especially if we work in healthcare, actually have lived or living experience with. We know that the last couple of years, especially in healthcare, have been particularly difficult and challenging for a number of reasons that some of which we'll get into today. And we know many people are struggling with their mental health at this time. So if that's the case, please know that there is help and support available. And this is how you would be in touch with us at Homewood Health should you wish to explore some of the other supports and services that we have available. I wish to take a moment in acknowledgement of the land as well. Today, I am calling in from the unceded and ancestral homelands of the Lekwungen-speaking people of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations here on beautiful Vancouver Island in BC. I'm aware that Chia is located on the unceded and ancestral homelands of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. So I just invite us, wherever we may be located today, just to take a moment in acknowledgement of the land and our own relationships to the land that we may be located on. Personally, I identify as a white settler of English ancestry, and it is really a privilege to live and reside here on these lands, especially on a beautiful fall day like today. It's hard not to feel deep appreciation for being able to live and work here. So I just invite us all to begin in this good way by taking a moment in acknowledgement of the land and the Indigenous people who have stewarded these lands since time immemorial. I also really want to acknowledge the social determinants of health today, especially in light of the topic that we're here to explore. So, as those of us who work in healthcare, we are likely already familiar with the idea of inequity in our healthcare systems and our mental health care systems. The social determinants of health really, speak to certain aspects of our sociocultural identities, certain living conditions that we can encounter that can really influence the degree to which we might experience things like power and privilege and or marginalization and oppression. And these are experiences that can ultimately affect how healthy we are. They can place additional health burden, for example, if we experience marginalization and oppression, health burden on us. And certainly when we talk about things like burnout, we know that there are certain communities of people that are disproportionately, again, affected with their mental health by certain systemic oppressions that they can encounter. So I just ask that we keep this all in mind as we navigate our content today. These social determinants apply to us as well in thinking about our own well-being, just in that acknowledgement that inequity does exist and helps to explain in some way why some people may be healthier than others. I mentioned this a little bit already, but certainly worth repeating that today's topic is something that many of us have lived experience with. I know I certainly do. I can recall two very distinct times in my own career working in the mental health care system and in the healthcare system during the pandemic, where I was experiencing burnout myself. I know it's likely that many of you on this call have some experience with this today as well, or might might be living it now. And so I just want to give people the heads up about that. We will be talking about mental health. And anytime we do that, it can stir up maybe things we haven't thought about in a while. It can put us in touch with emotions that maybe we haven't felt in a little while as well. So, if at any point during the session today you need to step away, take a break, come back to this content later, watch the recording, feel free to take care of yourselves today in whatever way you see fit. And do please reach out for additional support and help if it's something that you feel would benefit you. So, what will we be exploring in the hour that we have together today? We certainly will be talking about burnout and the ways in which burnout can impact our mental health. We'll talk as well just a little bit about stress, acute stress, and the mental health continuum. We'll certainly aim to raise awareness about the signs and symptoms of burnout so that we might be able to recognize it a bit better as we'll explore. Sometimes it can be hard to identify when we are experiencing burnout, and we'll talk about why that is in a moment or two. And then we'll also talk about what we can do about it. Now, I think it's really important to acknowledge that anytime we talk about burnout in systems, we run the risk, of suggesting to people that burnout is something that, they could prevent if they just took better care of themselves or were more resilient. And so, I really want to be mindful today about acknowledging and just reiterating the idea that burnout is actually really something that's created and maintained by systems. It's not a personal failing. It's not something to be ashamed of or to sort of bear the burden of in terms of I'm not resilient enough. I'm not doing enough self-care for myself. So when it comes to resolving burnout, we really need to look at what we can do and what is within our control as individuals. So we will look at individual resilience, but that's not to dismiss the fact that in terms of preventing burnout, there's certainly an organizational responsibility when it comes to addressing the systems factors that contribute to burnout, which we'll talk about as well. Now, today, I really invite your questions. I invite your sharing from your lived experience. I just want to acknowledge for those that are attending the live call that, in terms of using our chat today, there's some different ways that you might wish to participate. You might feel comfortable sharing your comments and questions with the whole group that's attending live today, or you may wish to just direct them to me privately, in which case the group won't actually see your name and what you've asked. I will, and I won't be reading out anybody's name today, even if you've shared it in the public chat, just as an added layer of privacy to the recording. So please feel free to share what you might like to, ask what you might like to, and then hopefully we'll have a bit of time as well at the end for any additional questions. So the place that I really want to start is with this acknowledgement of, the current status of mental health, not just, in Canada, but really around the world. We know that recent times, the COVID-19 pandemic, but also a number of different global, events, we're navigating war, we're navigating, inflation, we're navigating a mental health, pandemic as well, arguably. And these are conditions that have many of us reporting worsening health. So when it comes to our own country in Canada, the most recent data we have from 2020 suggests that 40% of Canadians would report deteriorating mental health since the beginning of this pandemic, and we know that that this burden on people's mental health has been borne disproportionately. So we know that there are people that have been affected more strongly in terms of their mental health. Think about healthcare workers actually being one of those populations. Also, racialized and Indigenous people, are people that again have experienced worsening mental health outcomes as a result of the pandemic, and that can have to do with some of those factors related to things like inequity and access to resources and dealing with oppression and violence. We also know that, even if we wouldn't necessarily say that our mental health has worsened or is in a state of, mental injury or illness, that many of us are navigating increased stress, fear, worry, and anxiety, and that these are pretty normal and predictable reactions in response to, really abnormal and extraordinary events, such as a pandemic and some of, the other global events that we find ourselves navigating during this time. So it's a really challenging time, in terms of mental health for many of us, not just in Canada, but also, around the world. Much has changed, and our reality continues to shift and change. For many of us in healthcare, especially in terms of workload, that has increased astronomically. There have been significant labor shortages in many industries. Healthcare, is one that has, had a lot of impact. I think across Canada, we see the impact of that in terms of services being delayed or shut down or inaccessible. So, really increased workload for many of us in healthcare. For those of us that may have more remote type work as opposed to frontline work, there's been this navigation of kind of being away from the workplace, working remotely, coming back into the workplace, a lot of disruption. Remote work, I think, regardless of our position, even if we work, on the front line, has really changed a lot of our processes and the way we do things. And this has required a lot of adjustment. In terms of, protocol, rules, processes, in healthcare, these have changed significantly, rapidly, in response to the different phases of the pandemic that we find ourselves navigating. There's been a lot of information to catch up with constantly. So this, again, has been very disruptive for many of us. Our lives have also been disrupted outside of work in terms of our access to, certain recreational activities. Now that we're resuming, or have resumed many activities, there's a lot of decisions that, we're having to make for ourselves around, our evaluation of risk and safety. So a lot of isolation as well that I think continues to impact us, even though, again, most of us are trying to resume some kind of social connection and recover some of our social health. I think that we're continuing to see the impacts of the pandemic and the impacts on our social health in terms of the ways that we might want to engage with others. And continue if we're people that identify as caregivers to navigate a number of challenges, right, and disruptions, around caring for children, for caring for elders as well. We may have continued concern about their health and their safety. So these are just some of the changes, that I think the last couple of years have brought upon us. If anybody on the live call today has other examples, things that really stand out to them as changes that have impacted them in the last couple of years, feel free to just pop those into chat and we'll read them out as well. But one of the big, I think, points here is that it's not just our work lives that have been disrupted and challenged. We also have personal lives and family domestic lives that we're navigating that have probably experienced significant change and disruption as well. Not seeing anything in chat, anything folks are adding, but again, feel free to do so if there's a change or a way that your reality has changed that you'd like to put out there for the group. So with change often comes, stress. With disruption often comes stress, and stress in and of itself isn't necessarily even a bad thing. There's many ways in which we can grow and develop. We can actually perform, very well sometimes under an appropriate level of stress. And, we probably, again, as folks that work in healthcare, also know how well our nervous systems are designed to be adaptive and to respond to threat and demands in our environment. The challenges, I think our nervous systems aren't well designed to handle chronic stress. So that's when the threat, the demand, the anxiety doesn't subside. And when we think about the ways that we work and live, in the year 2022, I think many of us are experiencing what we could describe as chronic stress, right? It's living, in a state of constant demand. And this is when we may be at the risk for increased, detrimental physical and mental health impacts. So again, our nervous systems are designed to handle threat. We see a threat or perceive a threat in our environment, we automatically get flooded with different chemicals that'll help us fight or flee the threat, that will help us survive. And what is intended to happen then is a period of recovery, right, where we can discharge some of that energy from our fight, flight, and freeze response, and then kind of come back to a place of homeostasis. The challenge with chronic stress, threat that doesn't subside, is that we have, levels of certain, neurohormones, things like cortisol, in our system that, never get discharged, and that can have an impact on things like our, brain tissue, our immune systems. We know when people experience chronic stress, they may experience an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, and other impacts, a greater loss of neurons, diminished capacity to produce new neurons in the brain, and other cognitive impacts as well. So again, stress is something we're designed to handle, but I think we're not designed well to handle it in a chronic type of way. And so I wanted to also show the spectrum of psychological health, just in that acknowledgement that, stress, adversity, challenge, threat, anxiety, these are all human experiences, things that all of us will, encounter from time to time on our human journey. And, for that reason, we can expect that things like our mood, our behavior, may fluctuate. If we look at the left side of the spectrum here, we see kind of psychological health and what that can look like, and that can include changes in our mood and behavior. So we move more towards the right side of the spectrum, more towards mental injury and mental illness. What we see is a greater impairment in our ability to function in our daily life. We might see an increase in the frequency of certain symptoms like anxiety and depressive symptoms. We might also see that these symptoms last, right? They're not something we can easily resolve or rid ourselves of. They tend to recur frequently. They last, a long period of time, or they may be experienced at a really acute level. And again, most significantly, they begin to impair our ability to function in daily life. So, again, we can be on this continuum in a dynamic way. We can kind of shift back and forth, but I wanted to show it to you, because although stress isn't a clinical diagnosis, nor is burnout, which we're going to talk about in a moment, there are things that can certainly contribute, to our sense of psychological health, and if they're not addressed, can actually again create some vulnerability in our mental health and well-being. So let's talk a bit about what burnout actually is. I've just mentioned to you, stress isn't in and of itself a mental health disorder, nor is burnout. You won't find burnout disorder anywhere in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. However, it is something that many of us experience and can impact our mental health. And as I mentioned to you earlier, burnout is something that is really created by and maintained by systems. So for that reason, I think we have to be careful about, assuming that it is just an individual problem, right? So we can understand what burnout is thinking about, the consequences of being under severe stress. And, in particular, in a way in which we're experiencing stress, but we also care a lot about the work we're doing. We may have very high ideals or standards of practice that we're trying to adhere to. And we may also be finding ourselves in conditions, working in systems where we are working, too hard, too much, and for too long. So I think about the healthcare industry and just my own experience working in it, right? And how so many of us are called to the work of care for that reason, because we care. We care. We are signing up, to take care of people and to perhaps provide a certain standard of care that we've been trained to. And so it can be very difficult when we encounter conditions that, again, demand a lot of us. And one of the things that can happen with burnout is sometimes we are overcompensating for gaps in the system, right? We're working too hard, too long, too much because maybe there's nobody else. Maybe we're experiencing a staff shortage, or we're encountering a problem where there's such high need, and we're trying to individually kind of compensate for some of those gaps. And so we might, again, be working for very long hours. You may have extreme workloads, not only extreme in the sense of, excessive in number or quantitatively, but the types of situations that we might be supporting, the types of people that might be needing our care and support can be very undisturbed, have very high need, maybe, are experiencing trauma and suffering. So this can be very emotionally demanding. And this demand on our emotional system can really begin to take a toll on our own physical and emotional and mental health. So these are some of the ways we might characterize what burnout is. And it can be very hard for us to identify it in ourselves. I think one of the things that can often come with burnout is this feeling like we're feeling that we're not doing enough, we're not good at our job, we're incompetent in some way. So there may be this desire to just work harder, right? Or this belief that if I only do this, or I work a bit harder, I'll be able to stay on top of it. So we might not see it as burnout. We might see that, oh, this is just a hard time, and I'll just work harder as a way of trying to get through it. And so one of the characteristics that we kind of look for that can differentiate burnout from stress, which, for many of us is a part of working life, is this feeling of helplessness or hopelessness and/or apathy. So that feeling of being checked out, numbed out, sort of not sure what to do, feeling a bit of desperation in terms of our situation, tend to be things that characterize the experience of burnout. Yeah, and there's a comment that was directed to me privately, so I'll just read it out. The idea that there's a couple kinds of burnout this person is sharing from their experience. There's the experience of workplace burnout, but also caregiver burnout as well. So yes, thank you so much for naming that to the person that shared this idea that today we're really talking about a workplace context, but certainly, if we're, caring for elders, if we're caring for, children, if we're caring for other family members or friends, certainly, these are experiences that, people that are in those roles can relate to as well in terms of their giving, right? And how much they might be working. So thank you for naming that. So in a moment, I'm going to ask the group that's attending live here today to just share, from your own experience, how does it show up for you? Because, when it comes to the physical, emotional, and behavioral impact of burnout, I think that can impact, us very differently, right? We may have varied experiences in terms of how it shows up. But I did want to talk a little bit about some of the factors that can really drive it in a system. Because, again, today, it's important for us to realize that burnout is something that is created by, maintained by systems. So some of the systemic factors that can give rise to the experience of worker burnout is when workers really, experience a lack of control over their work. So this can be driven by things like, very high workload, uh, excessive responsibility, deadline pressures as well. These are things that, again, can be a part of work, and we acknowledge that, but there tends to be a bit of an excessive nature to them. The work environment itself and dysfunction in terms of culture can be a driving factor as well. Dealing with, a public that can be threatening, that can be volatile. I know throughout the COVID-19 pandemic and doing a lot of work with different healthcare teams, this was a huge issue in terms of, some of the restrictions and facilities that, in particular frontline staff were having to communicate, and some of the conflict, the situations there. Exposure, in the sense of working in a trauma exposed environment. This can be something that can also, place again a high emotional burden on workers. And then sometimes there is, an issue around culture in the workplace. There's a lack of support. We might work in environments that are high conflict, right? Without a lot of tools to be able to navigate that. There may be other things going on in terms of the psychological health and safety of the environment that contribute to some of these systems issues. Support is huge. So some people will experience a lack of support at work. They feel they can't speak to their leader about what's going on. It's not psychologically safe to do that. They may, have a sense of low morale in the team that they work in. It might be really difficult when we're experiencing burnout to reach out for help. And for some people, they may experience it at both ends. They may feel unsupported at work, but they may also feel unsupported in their personal life. They may feel as though they're failing everywhere, right? Failing at home, failing at work, not able to meet all of the needs and demands that are around them. So there can be a real lack of support as well. And this work-life imbalance, right? When we're working till midnight every night, that kind of sets us up, right, to be in a state of imbalance in terms of having enough time to attend to our own emotional needs and physical needs and mental needs as well. So these are some of the, again, the factors that can really drive burnout in organizations. And if there's others that come to your mind as well, things that you think systemically kind of contribute, feel free if you'd like to name those in chat. Where we're going next is what I set us up for in terms of asking people to reflect a bit on how burnout shows up for them physically, emotionally, or behaviorally. So if you are willing to share anything from your experience in terms of how that shows up for you, feel free again to put that into chat today. In my own experience, my more recent experience of burnout, working in healthcare specifically, for me, there was definitely that feeling of failing. So when we talk about kind of that helplessness and hopelessness type feeling, or the feeling like, maybe I'm not cut out for this, if only I worked harder, maybe things could be a bit different. Those are feelings that definitely showed up for me. I think that began to, impact me and my sense of, my ability to do work. The other way that I think it showed up for me specifically was this feeling of I don't even know what to do. There was so much to do in terms of the amount of responsibilities, the amount of work, the urgency and importance of all of that work, that there are days that I would just turn on my computer and stare into my screen and not feel certain where to even begin, or how to even triage, the types of acuity that were coming, across my desk. So there was this feeling of just being frozen and really difficult to kind of get out of. So those were some of the ways that was showing up in my experience. And I think I've got some people sharing here in chat, talking about the different ways that it kind of shows up. Somebody is just reiterating, oh, that's so true. That sense of low self-esteem, questioning if you're doing a good enough job, doubting yourself in every action, or second guessing yourself. Yeah. When everything is urgent and important, right? It's like, am I making the right choices? Is this, um, you know, is this really what I should be paying attention to? So that doubt that can come in, and self-doubt. Somebody else is sharing, I actually feel it in my throat first. I start thinking I'm feeling sick, but it's fatigue. I also start craving candy. Yeah, sugar, an intense stress sign for me. Absolutely. Yes. Thank you. Those are, ways that they can show up for other people, right? We deal with stress in different ways, wanting to eat certain foods, noticing that impact on the body. Somebody else is sharing, definitely getting snappy and frustrated with the systems failing, or the families that we're working with. Yeah. So that sense of anger as well, is something, I've heard and a lot of people reflect on in terms of their experience of burnt out. Like, I know I'm burnt out when I don't have one good thing to say, about my work or working here. And, there can be a lot of frustration and and nowhere for that to go, right? People can feel kind of stuck in that. So another comment here on frozen, an inability to start, urge to finish the easiest things first. Yes, I can relate to that one. It's like, I'll just do some invoicing. That would just be a bit easier, right? Than trying to tackle this, impossible problem. Feeling tired, lack of motivation and hunger, loneliness. Yes, isolation and resentment. Yeah, absolutely. Those are all things that I felt myself also, in particular that loneliness, right? And so, um, when we don't have that sense of connection, right, or support at work, or we don't feel like we have places we can turn, to share this burden with, that becomes very risky for us in terms of our well-being. And that feeling like I don't even know who I can tell or explain this to. If we're leaders, in healthcare, or any other industry too, there can be that sense of I don't want to burden my team with this. I am nervous to talk about this potentially with my own leader. Where do I go, to get support and help? So thank you, everyone. Those are, again, things that are important to name and different ways that we can experience burnout. I will just add on a little bit to what you've already shared in terms of feeling tired, drained, lower immunity, so getting sick more of the time, frequent headaches, back pain, muscle aches, and change in appetite or sleep habits as well. So this can be in either direction, right? Eating too much, not eating enough, not being able to sleep, or feeling like you could sleep for 1,000 years and not, actually be energized by that. Emotional signs and symptoms. So self-doubt was mentioned, right? Feeling as though you failed, feeling like there's no way out, right? That helpless, feeling that can come over us. Detachment, right? Feeling alone, a loss of motivation, cynicism and negativity, right? Frustration at, some of the systemic challenges that we might be encountering. And certainly having less satisfaction and pride in our work as well. It can be one of those impacts. Behaviorally, we can start to withdraw, isolate ourselves. It can take a lot longer to get things done, right? Everything can feel really overwhelming. So it can certainly begin to impact our work. Some of us might cope by using substances. That is something we know has increased over this time of pandemic as well in Canada, is the substance use patterns of Canadians. So one way that we may be trying to cope with distress. Irritability, somebody was mentioning that. So taking it out on other people, taking it out on people at work or at home, right? Coming home and just, feeling really irritable with our partner or our children. And then, this desire to skip out on work, leaving early, coming late, again, can really begin to impact our sense of engagement with our workplace. So pretty severe consequences, right? Not only to us, most importantly, I think to us and our well-being in terms of our physical health, can even begin to impact our experience of things like, mood. So things like depression can become an increased risk for us. Certainly our own satisfaction and productivity at work can begin to be increased, can be impacted. When we look at impacts to the workplace as well, we see things like increased absenteeism and presenteeism. So presenteeism is when you are physically at work, but mentally, emotionally, not really at work. So, you're there in body, but not necessarily in any other way, which, can impact things like productivity, but it can also impact things like errors, right? Accidents, and certainly can contribute to a sense of poor morale and communication challenges, as well as turnover, right? We lose a lot of incredible people to burnout, especially in the healthcare industry. So some pretty serious consequences here to us and to the organizations that we work for. And I mentioned to you, some of us may be at a greater risk of burnout. Thinking about, people that work in our industry, in healthcare specifically. Again, many of us, identify as caregivers, as people that care. It's not only a job, it's a calling. It's something that brings a lot of meaning and purpose to our lives. So, when that is us, it describes how we relate to our work. It might be increasingly harder for us to strike a balance between work and life. Again, we might never feel like the work that we're doing is good enough. So I think about those of us that work with really underserved populations, so people that are at increased vulnerability. I think about the families, the children that you work with, at CHIO, and may have a high need that's not met. So we might, very well feel as though, what, I'm not able to really help this family, this child. Um, I'm not doing enough. They need more. I'd like to do more, and that can lead us to feel like we are again not doing our job properly, that we're inadequate, we're incompetent. um, that lack of control, right? That can be related to things like volume as well, right? We don't necessarily get to decide how many people need our help on any given day. We can feel, out of control when it comes to our workload, right? How much work we have to do. The demands, placed on us may be quite unreasonable. When we look about at the number of staff we have on a given day and what we're expected to do or who we're expected to care for, right? Um, that might not be a reasonable balance at all. And this last one are in roles that are not a good fit. So I can relate to this one actually at a certain point in my career where I inherited a portfolio that I didn't have a lot of experience with, and that actually became very consuming for me in terms of the demands of that particular portfolio, and I actually didn't feel like I had the skills, to do that work. I had to try to acquire them really quickly, and so, I, in my own experience again, felt that that was a factor that was kind of contributing to how I was feeling because ultimately what my job had become was no longer actually a good fit with my skills, nor actually even my interests, in terms of my professional career. So things had changed. And so again, that's not to blame or say, maybe you're just in the wrong job. But sometimes, especially when there's significant shifting in roles where your job becomes something different or something that you maybe didn't expect, this can become a factor where our work no longer feels like the best fit for us and our values or skill set even. So sometimes that can play in as well. So again, big reminder here, big takeaway, this is not a personal failing. We can think about burnout as something that is created by and exists within systems. And although today we're really talking a lot about, what we can control and, the individual, piece around how do we navigate this, there also, needs to be a systemic response to burnout. And sometimes we can be a part of that depending on our organization and how we're working on things like psychological health and safety together. Sometimes we feel as though we don't have a lot of influence in our system, and we're left to sort of figure out, how do I take care of myself? How do I navigate the experience that I'm having in the system that I'm working in? So something that can be really helpful, especially if we're very overwhelmed again by system dysfunction and gaps, is to really evaluate what is within our ability to control and change. We sometimes cannot, impact the things that are, influencing our experience the most. We don't have the resources. We don't have the decision-making ability necessarily. But if we look closely at, I think we can always find, particular things that we do get to choose and control. We don't get to choose and control everything. So some of those things, that we can think about is, the potential of discussing our situation, right, with our leader or with human resources. I appreciate that not everybody feels and experiences the psychological health and safety to have really candid conversations around, what, I can't keep up with this workload, or this is unreasonable, in terms of the resources we have and what we can do. I've seen some teams where absolutely those conversations could be had and had well, and others where it was just, there wasn't the right level of psychological safety. So if that's the case, is there anybody else in your organization that you can talk to, to discuss what the options are? Thinking about our own work-life balance, right? Sometimes we have to take matters into our own hands, right? And make decisions around what we're going to focus on, outside of work. So reconnecting with the things that bring us joy, setting boundaries and limits for ourselves can be very empowering potentially as well. Having and pursuing personal goals at work and outside of work, very important. That can counteract at times that feeling of a lack of control, right, over what's going on. Sometimes we need to take time away or build more time away into our schedule and seeking support. Again, today's session is educational, preventative by nature, but, reaching out for more support from family, from friends, from people that, we trust, from, professionals even that can provide some support as well. Yeah, and I have a question that's come, so I'll take that now, and thank you to the person that asked this. I'll just read out the question. How can we determine if the feeling for the needing to be re-energized by a new role or change in responsibility is simply a need for change or a symptom of burnout? Yeah, what a great question in terms of, if we're noticing the desire for change or feeling a lack of energy. Could it be that we're just not necessarily being challenged enough in our work, or could it be burnout? And so, I think that there's a number of factors here in terms of, a personal situation and the individual involved, right? What else could be going on in their life and their career? But again, what I think we look for in burnout is that feeling of helplessness, hopelessness, and apathy. So is, the desire for change coming from, again, a place of energy, right? A desire to be stimulated, to kind of grow, to learn, to develop. Are there opportunities to do that in your current role or not, right? Or, is what you're experiencing more of the feeling of, what, I can't do this for another day, I need to get out of here. Is it sort of more that type of a narrative that is driving the need, to look around maybe for other roles or positions? So, I think again, when it's, something that we're doing because of that feeling like, I can't go on another day, that might be something worth, investigating, I think, on the burnout side. But the reality is, many of us need more stimulation in our work, right? We need new challenges. We need to grow, develop. We might be feeling just a sense of lack of engagement or kind of checking out because we're not getting our emotional needs met from our work. So this is a really great question, I think, to explore, further, um, with somebody such as, at Home and Health, we have people that do life smart coaching services around career, just figuring out what are my emotional needs at work and am I getting them met, from my current role? Do I need something new? So I'm not sure if that's helpful or not, but certainly something I can think of when it comes to trying to get a sense of if it's burnout or not. Thank you. Hopefully that was somewhat helpful. So, and by any other questions, feel free to just pop them into chat. I'll be sure to circle back to them before we finish up today. But a few other pieces here around things that we can do on the individual side of addressing, burnout. And that is, addressing some of the inner narratives, right, that begin to emerge when we are experiencing burnout, which often have to do with I'm failing, I'm no good at this job, I'm not getting it right. And so this is where practices like mindfulness and self-compassion can really help us. I know for myself, I practice self-compassion. It's been something that's really helped me in a number of different areas of my life, but it's basically the desire to treat ourselves with the same kindness and care that we would a friend, a patient that we're seeing, a client. It's that idea that we are worthy and deserving of our own kindness and understanding as much as we extend that to other people. And again, as folks that work in healthcare, I think we know the value of kindness and understanding in terms of delivering excellent care. The challenge we often face is making that reflexive, returning that to ourselves. So if we're having a tough time, if we're struggling, if we're overwhelmed physically and mentally, how can we treat ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we might somebody else in our life. Acknowledging that we're having a tough time, acknowledging that we're struggling, asking ourselves, is there anything I can do to support you? Is there anything that you need? I can see it's a hard day. This is a hard moment. Telling ourselves we're doing our best, evaluating, you know what, I'm doing my best in a situation that's really unreasonable. This is the best I can do, today or right now. So sometimes, again, treating ourselves with that kindness and understanding is just something that helps protect us from some of the erosion of our self-esteem and our confidence that can come when we experience burnout. Really taking the time to step away, right, to evaluate the impact and the consequence of burnout on our mind, our bodies, and our emotions, right? Noticing what's happening, taking the time to really tune into ourselves to say, you know what, I'm not doing well. What feels like that sickness in my throat could be my body telling me that, um, you know, that things have become unhealthy for me at work. What do I need to do in response to that? So if we don't acknowledge it as a problem, there's not a lot we can do to correct it, right? And so anytime we want to make change in our lives, that acceptance of where we are, that acknowledgement that something is a problem is always the first step. Thinking about what we can control and change. There's a great deal that is outside of our control, right? We can't control the people. We can't force other people to change. We can, think about the factors within ourselves, that we have the capacity to change. We can think about the actions that we can take, the thoughts that we can think, the feelings that we can feel. And so thinking about creating a plan around that. And this one is particularly important, reviving our competency. So because there tends to be this erosion of self-esteem that can come, right, with burnout experiences, it's important that we remember and remind each other of our strengths, our skills, our resources, what we're passionate about, what we value. So it's reviving this for ourselves, and again, shoring each other up in this important work that we do by reminding one another of our competency, our skills, our strengths, because they can tend to be neglected or forgotten if we're experiencing burnout. A couple, other pieces here, and a couple of questions in chat that have come that I'll take actually. One is how you can apply this to a personal caretaker role, such as a parent, to prevent burnout within your own home. Such an excellent question. So thanks to the person that asked this. And I know that was mentioned earlier as well. We may be experiencing burnout at work, but if we are caregivers, also in our homes. So things like compassion fatigue, for example, that exhaustion of our empathy and compassion muscles, just by way of how often we're using them, is something that can happen to us too. And so I would say actually a lot of the strategies are quite similar, in terms of self-compassion for caregivers is huge. The ability to, again, acknowledge for ourselves that we are deserving too of kindness and understanding. We are also deserving of care. A lot of these resilient strategies, work very well in a caregiving situation, taking time for ourselves. I know this can be really hard. I'm a working parent myself. I have a young son. And, sometimes it feels like, how can I possibly insert any time to care for myself, given all the demands in my life? But one thing that's really helped me is, thinking about self-care, instead of thinking about it in chunks of an hour and half an hour, is thinking about things that I can do in 5 minutes or less. That really works for me. So the time that I spend driving and commuting with my son, is time that I think about, okay, how can I do something kind, relaxing for myself? If I have 5 minutes between a meeting, how can I fit that self-care in? Reviving competency as well, beginning to really take a look at the impact that our, burnout, whether it's, in a caregiving situation or the workplace, the impact that that has on our self-esteem, right? And our relationship with ourselves, and taking steps to correct that. So that's where mindfulness, I think, is really important. People have asked as well about the coaching service. Yeah, so if you call that number, the 1-800-663-1142 number, I'll put it up again before we end today. The coaching service is LifeSmart Coaching Services. It can be really helpful as well if you're interested in support for caregiving, to access coaching support for that as well. So all you would need to do is indicate your interest in that in calling into the main Homewood client care line. And separate than counseling, it is a different service. So feel free to ask about it, and more information can be provided. Also, if you have access to Home Web, the online service, which you can sign up for, I think anybody can that has access to Homewood services through your employer, you can find out more about it there as well. And then I also see a comment here that we also have a supporting the caregiver presentation on October 20th from Homewood Health, which may be helpful for those experiencing caregiver burnout. Thank you so much for that. So do check that session out specifically as well if you identify as a caregiver and are curious to learn a bit more. So a few final pieces. We are moving towards the last 10 minutes or so. We will hopefully have a little bit of time for any final questions as well. So if there's something that you wanted to ask, feel free to maybe pop that into chat now, and I will come back to that in just a moment. But a few final pieces around taking care of ourselves. Again, what differentiates burnout from just experiencing a difficult patch, or maybe some disengagement, feeling unsafe, impacts to our self-esteem. And I would say this piece around powerlessness and helplessness, in particular, we want to really be mindful and watchful for those types of signs and symptoms in ourselves, and to seek support if that's what we're noticing. A few final strategies and tips, again, to think about things that can be helpful. I do want to acknowledge, again, depending on the type of role you have in a healthcare environment, some of these, can be harder to implement in terms of, workplace self-care. I know taking breaks in healthcare, in frontline healthcare, can be incredibly difficult to do reliably for a number of factors. But it is important that we find time, to eat, to hydrate, to take a moment to perhaps, practice something like mindfulness and self-compassion. These are things that can help refresh our energy and attention, and can help us better, handle the psychological demands of our work. Being able to organize our work environment. This one was actually huge for me. When there's 500 emails that you have to deal with, that can feel pretty overwhelming. So finding systems that help support us in terms of work design can be really helpful as well. Breaking down overwhelming projects into these smaller achievable tasks so we can experience that sense of achievement is also something that can be helpful. Finding sufficient time to be away from the workplace. I know during the pandemic, so many of us just canceled our vacation, right? Because there was, no one else to work, or we were really needed. That adds up over time, right? Not having time away to rest and recover. So trying to build that in. Working as teams to ensure that we're recognizing success and celebrating success. So important for any workplace, that we feel like our work actually has meaning and purpose and is making a difference. So thinking about how we can do that individually, but also in the context of our teams. Boundaries, something for caregivers, something for us as workers as well to think about. This has become increasingly complex, I think, given the fact that many of us are working, in a remote context, right? If we're not a frontline worker, so many of us have hybrid work arrangements. When do we stop work, right? Work is always there. It's just a phone away or a computer away. So boundaries, I think, have never been more important when it comes to our work-life balance. Knowing what the supports are as well. What is it that is available to help us, to support us? Some of these supports may be through things like your EFAP providers, such as Home and Health. There may be other supports, other things that are available in terms of people to talk to or services to make use of. I can't emphasize enough the importance of, being kind to ourselves, offering ourselves compassion, when we're experiencing challenging times at work and in life. Attending to the basics, so sleep, diet, and exercise. It's hard to have a great mood if these things are compromised, because they are so intricately tied to our experience of mood. Gratitude as well, another evidence-based practice that can help us improve our mood overall. This is the practice of looking for things to appreciate. I would say this is one of the things that served as my lifeline, actually, working in some very challenging positions. It was always trying to find things to appreciate about my work and the people around me. And I'll emphasize this one as well, focusing on what is in our control. Just asking ourselves that question sometimes, is this something that I actually have any influence or control over or not? And if not, is continuing to ruminate on it having any benefit? That's a question that we can kind of ask ourselves at times to, redirect our energy right into the things we can control and focus on. We are almost out of time today. We have about 4 minutes or so left to just wrap up with the session, to take any final questions, but also to hear from you today. If anybody who is attending live here wants to emphasize, part of the presentation that stood out for them. So any takeaways, anything that think that you would like to try or implement, from our session today. Always really helpful to hear what stood out to folks today. So just an invitation for any comment on that, any takeaways, or any final questions that you might have. Maybe as folks contemplate that, anything that they'd like to ask or share in closing, I will just take a moment to put the evaluation link into the chat box. This is very helpful in terms of getting feedback on the session, improving it, and just hearing about things that I could do a little bit differently. So just bear with